Here to explain more about the impact trauma and violence has on youth is the director of the California Homeless Youth Project. The California Homeless Youth Project is an initiative that highlights issues and solutions for youth ages 12 to 24 who are living on the edge of homelessness or are currently homeless in California. If you can please help me welcome Shahara Hyatt. And as she's walking up here, if I can say this, her story is amazing. In addition to also experiencing homelessness as a family, she at one point dropped out of high school, but ultimately continued her education and now has a master's in social work. She's authored several publications on the topic of homeless youth, and including the policy briefs for the nation's first statewide action plan on ending youth homelessness. And hopefully she'll give us some one-line zingers, because she's also a comedian. Shahara Hyatt.
Thanks so much, Krista. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and get my PowerPoint up. Like Krista mentioned, I am a social worker and I do comedy. So I like to tell people that now I have 2 jobs I don't do for the money. But it's great work, and I'm really happy to do it. And so we got a sense for kind of who is in the room, who's working here, and I wanted to know who else is in the room. So if you can, I like a participatory crowd. Make some noise if you work in health. Yeah. Cool. Okay, how about education? Yeah, awesome. We have probation, law enforcement. Saw some tables. Cool, shout out to you all in the back. Community members that are interested in seeing an end to homelessness. Great. That's all of us. I'm sure there's a lot that I missed. But like I said, in doing comedy, I like a participatory crowd. So if you hear anything throughout the course of this speech that you feel like resonates with you, go ahead and give some snaps. Or if snaps are hard, you can do some like spirit fingers. But I sort of thought that, that's something that can help to create a relationship for all of us to each other, and know that, these messages that are being shared up here aren't just mine and mine alone, and see where we have relationship. Does that make sense? So give me some snaps if that makes sense. Okay, cool. You all are already a really great crowd. So like Krista mentioned, I am the director of the California Homeless Youth Project, and our goal is to educate policymakers on the needs of young people experiencing homelessness in our state. And so we do that by creating original research where we ask young people about their lived experiences with homelessness. We read the latest reports coming out, and we try to write about it in ways that are easy for people to understand. So whether it's media, or legislators or city council members, we want to let people know what they need to know and how they can help. And we really pride ourselves on listening to the experiences of young people who have been homeless so that our ideas about solutions are based in reality, right? Because we know that they're the experts of their own experiences. Cool. So I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about my story. The seed was planted one night when my good friend Nikki came over, and she was a street outreach worker working with young people experiencing homelessness in Sacramento. And they had, a 6-bed emergency shelter for minors and a transitional shelter for young people, another 6 beds, but no one in our community knew just how much that doesn't meet the need as she does, because she was doing street outreach to people who, weren't having a place to stay and didn't have the option to. And while we were hanging out at my house and talking one night, I started to wonder if I could be doing more with my own living room. I was, seeing this issue and seeing so many young people in my community in need of support. And I thought, well, my living room has double doors that close, and, I have a master's in social work. Let me think about that. And a week or two later, I showed up to the drop-in center in Sacramento, where, the Women's Center also has a drop-in center, and this is a refuge for young people that are oftentimes living outside or in other precarious housing situations. And it's a safe place for them to go and get the support that they need. And it was there that I met Mo. Uh, I came to kind of talk with him about the biggest issues facing them in the community. I wanted to hear firsthand from their perspectives what they saw as pressing problems, and then talk with them about how we could be partners in a solution together. So I met Mo, and he was energetic and just full of thoughts on the matter. He was 20 years old, and he moved to Sacramento from Stockton, seeking refuge from violence, but losing his already minimal social and economic safety net in the process. And we talked for a while, first about issues in our community, then about his hopes to get off the streets and start college. He was sleeping in parks and on the steps of City Hall, and he told me that he wanted to trade the clothes in his backpack for school books. And I told him, if you ever need any help with that, let me know. And he said, okay, and if you ever need any help with anything, let me know. And we just kind of had an instant connection. And during that time, I came back over the next several weeks to keep filming these young people talking about the issues facing them in the community. And Mo didn't know it, but during that time, I began laying the groundwork of becoming a host home by talking to my partner about that concept and about Mo specifically. And my partner was supportive but skeptical. And I knew it would take a little bit of time, so we just kept the conversations going. And he didn't know this kid. And he didn't know the life of being a homeless teenager and college student like I did. He didn't know what it was like to rely on the community outside of one's family to get your basic needs for food and shelter met by people you aren't related to. You see, I also struggled with homelessness in middle school, high school, and community college. I bounced on couches while staying off and on with my family in long-term motel rooms in the worst parts of town. My family also struggled with poverty, substance use, and a system that sometimes felt indifferent or even hostile to our plight. And I knew exactly how homelessness could disrupt one's education. In fact, I dropped out of high school because of it. I didn't drop out of high school because I was disconnected from my education. I knew that furthering my education could be a pathway out of poverty. I had seen my cousin get out, who had also experienced homelessness and substance use, and went on to get her PhD, and she showed me a model of how to move forward. But I dropped out of high school at 16, and I took the California High School equivalency exam in order to enroll in community college, where my class schedule could accommodate a work schedule, because I needed, even at 15, 16, to be making my own money, as many young people do. And as a result, I never skipped a semester between preschool and grad school. But if my community hadn't stepped up to provide those couches and makeshift bedrooms, there's no way I would have gone on to get my master's degree, to direct a statewide organization on ending youth homelessness, and to be delivering this keynote for all of you here today. And you can see, so this picture on the right, that's me and my siblings. I'm one of 4 kids. And then on the left, that's me and Mo, and that's when he came to stay with me. So Mo moved in with me and stayed for 4 months. During that time, he was able to begin to stabilize the health and mental health issues that developed as a result of the trauma of living outside. He got his GED and enrolled in college. He increased his social circle, enabling him to find a job. And he eventually moved out and rented his own room in an apartment in South Sacramento. We've stayed in touch since he moved out about 2 years ago, and he still knows where to come for a hug or a meal or just to hear I love you. And things are still hard for him, because we don't live in a fundamentally different society 2 years later, and problems aren't always solved overnight. I get some snaps for that. It's a long haul work, right? It's complicated, but we're in this together. And that's a message that I think we can all benefit from hearing and sharing more often. Great, thank you. So what is youth homelessness? The way we tend to think about it is anyone who's lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. You know, what is the place that you have to stay? Sometimes you can have a roof over your head, but it's not a place that you can really stay. You don't have a key, you're not on a lease. Maybe there's other kind of complicated dynamics involved, whether you're trading sex for a place to stay, or it's a coercive or environment, or a place where there's domestic violence. It can look like all kinds of things. It can look like couch surfing, like I mentioned, or being doubled up. You know, when maybe one person or one family goes to stay with another person or family. It can mean sleeping outside or in abandoned buildings, in bus or train depots, cars, hotels and motels, emergency shelters, or transitional housing. And when I say homeless youth or youth experiencing homelessness a lot, I'm talking both sometimes about those under 18, and then also transition-aged youth, which is kind of that 18 to 24, 18 to 25 age range. And we talk about that community because even though they're technically adults, developmentally they're still in a unique place. And so they have different needs than other adults do. So thinking about like not having, you know, employment history or rental history or things like that. And it's also a time of identity formation. And so thinking about where are these young people at a time of identity formation, right? Are they on the streets? Are they experiencing homelessness? Think about that in terms of like a lifetime trajectory into having a career or a vision for your future. At the time when you're building vision, it's so critical to have that support. Yeah, so there are different definitions that people use around youth homelessness, but I think this tends to be the most common and the most inclusive. Okay. So youth homelessness in California, what does it look like in our state? So in our state, about 250,000 students experienced homelessness in our schools in the 2015-16 school year. And that's almost 5% of our student body. That's a really big number. Nationally, about 2% of students are experiencing homelessness, still too high. In California, almost 5% of students are experiencing homelessness. So we have a real problem in our state in particular. Nationally, we've got about 1/3 of the young people experiencing homelessness are in California, even though we only have about 12% of the population. So we have such a large share of the nation's homeless young people. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one, you may all guess, California ranks 50th in the country in terms of housing affordability, right? We have some structural crises around being able to afford and maintain a safe place to live. And I think that probably even a lot of us working in here feel that crunch. I'm gonna snap for myself. It's like my rent has gone up $350 in 2 years, so I'm like, I'm feeling it. It's hard for folks. That second data point down there, so saying a little over 11,000 young people were counted staying outside on a single night in January. So that's what that number is. That's how many people in these kind of annual or biannual point in time counts, communities across our state were able to count as just sleeping outside. So a really big number still. But we also believe these are kind of an undercount, but they help us to get a sense for where we're at. Cool. So continuing on in youth homelessness in California, there's been some great research that's been coming out of the college system around food and housing insecurity. I know sometimes people think that like college students experiencing homelessness, like if you got into college, you must be fine. Or that's a time of chosen poverty, or it's okay to live off of ramen. But we tend to think that those hardships aren't really fair and they aren't really conducive to your education. So in the California State University system, about 1 in 10 students is experiencing some form of homelessness, like I talked about, which is honestly even higher than I would have thought. And I've been doing this work for almost a decade now. I know that I look like I'm 17 and I'm like a little bit older. When we look at community college, I don't have a data point for it up there, but some national research has shown us that about half of community college students are experiencing housing insecurity, and 14% are having a literal homelessness episode. So they're staying like outside or in cars or those kinds of situations, which is huge. And the students that are most likely to be experiencing homelessness are former foster youth and pregnant and parenting students. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The other thing that was interesting to me in that was that The students who were homeless were just as likely to be working as their peers, but they were less likely to be making a living wage, so less likely to be making at least $15 an hour. I think that helps us to challenge some of our ideas about people living in poverty, right? These folks are working, and they're working hard. They're just not making enough to be able to meet their needs. Even with financial aid, there's often still a big gap. And I pointed out a little bit earlier, transition-aged youth have unique developmental needs and tend to avoid the adult homelessness services system. Oftentimes their health or mental health or substance use issues aren't as severe as maybe an older, more chronically homeless adult, and so they really do need services that are more tailored to them so that they can feel safety in being able to access what's available. Another point I would like to point out is that youth homelessness exists all across the country, right? It's not just an urban problem. We see it in urban, suburban, and rural areas. We know like in places like Los Angeles or New York, maybe there's some of the highest numbers of people experiencing homelessness, but when we looked at student homelessness, 3 of the 5 counties with the highest percentages of student homelessness were actually rural counties, Trinity, Lake, and Sierra. So that was a really significant finding to me, to say that it's actually pretty proportional when you look at rural and urban communities, but a lot of times in our more rural areas, there's less services available. Which brings me to that last point on there. So when we did some research looking at what are the services for homeless young people across our state, we found that 2/3 of California's 58 counties had no programs for young people experiencing homelessness. So again, when we think about what are like the myths and stereotypes out there about young people maybe just that don't want to mow the lawn on Saturdays or just had a fight with their parents and want to live off the grid, that's not really what we see. We know that in most of our communities we actually have no programs for these young people, so we're really lucky when we think about what's happening here in the San Joaquin County and here in Stockton to have women's, youth, and family services. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Great. So how are we doing in San Joaquin County? So when we look at student homelessness from 2011 to 2014, it increased from a little over 2,800 students to a little over 3,300 students. Again, we tend to think that that might be a bit of an undercount because it's hard to identify students experiencing homelessness. They don't always come forward. They might be afraid of what could happen to them or their family if they come forward, especially if they're undocumented folks. But this is the best that we're doing at really trying to identify these students so that their rights can be upheld and so they can get support. When we see, almost half or 46% of households in the San Joaquin County have a high housing cost burden, that means they spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So historically it used to be we spent about a third or 30% of our income on housing, and that's really increased, I think, across the country, and it's clearly particularly a problem here in San Joaquin. We looked at child poverty. About 23% of children in California are experiencing poverty. That's inexcusable to me. I think, thank you. I got a snap right there. I'm here for us, girl. And then when you look at San Joaquin, it's about 26 to 29%. So again, kind of even a little bit more than the averages that we're seeing. So next slide. So who does this problem affect? Well, one of the communities that it affects is LGBT youth, or lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. That Q sometimes stands for queer or questioning. So research has shown that about 20 to 40% of young people experiencing homelessness identify as LGBT. And that, again, it's not just in San Francisco or LA. That's true even in rural and suburban areas across the country. And why is that the case? Well, 25 to 40% of these young people tell us it's because of family rejection. So being maybe kicked out of their homes because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity is the reason that they have ended up on the streets. And I think that sometimes, parents or caregivers, They want to do the best for their children, and I think in these cases, a lot of times they're scared for their children and try to show kind of like a tough love. And unfortunately, what we see is that with those rejecting behaviors is that it increases suicide risk actually really dramatically. And the more we can have families increase their accepting behaviors, the safer their young person will be. Yeah, cool, I saw some snaps. Y'all are really catching on to this. The other issue is they become homeless for the same reasons really anybody else does, right? Poverty, not being able to afford a place to stay. And then difficulty finding culturally competent or like relevant services. You know, one of the things, I've done a lot of focus groups with LGBT homeless young people, and they tell me that sometimes they experience discrimination in LGBT specific spaces around their housing and economic status. You know, if it costs money to go to Pride or to a fundraiser, or if you have to be 21 to get into that gay bar. You know, how can you build community if there are all these age and financial barriers? So they feel that. And then sometimes they feel discrimination in, you know, the homelessness services system around their sexual orientation or gender identity. So what they've really asked for is they want, again, unique, safe places for them to be, and they want them to be culturally competent for all young people. And the more that we're inclusive of this community, the safer it will be for all young people. Yeah, great. So some of the characteristics, what we've seen in the research is that, you know, these young people are very likely to report family conflict, much of which is exacerbated by poverty. So we think about the example of doubled up earlier, right? If you and your family get kicked out of your house and you go to live with another family that's also living in substandard, overcrowded housing, and you get in a fight with your sibling or with your parent, there's no place to cool off, and you're hungry, you know, think about like how much that would contribute to family conflict. I mean, I think personally, when I'm hungry because I've skipped a meal, I'm on edge, right? When I don't sleep well one night, I'm like, my faculties are greatly diminished, let's put it that way. So thinking about, you know, the types of things that these folks are up against and how that contributes to conflict, it's not just that people are bad or don't want to do the right thing, is that there's a lot of like material constraints that make it harder to. They're far more likely to be physically or sexually victimized than their peers, and many of them are victimized repeatedly. These young people are 3 times as likely to be pregnant or parenting as their housed counterparts. And then we see really high rates of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidality, so suicidal thinking or behaviors. They often have difficulty finding employment, and that means that they're forced into the street economy. So when we don't have jobs for young people, I think it's important to think about the ladders of opportunity that are available to them. Again, they're wanting to survive, they're wanting to do the right thing, but when they don't have their most basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, met, we see what they do, right, as a community. And that can look all different kinds of ways. A new bit of research that just came out last week found that 1 in 5 homeless young people is being trafficked in some form. So labor trafficking or sex trafficking, you know, working in agricultural, domestic work. There's all kinds of ways these young people are being exploited just because they want and need to make money in order to survive. And so when we don't offer them other alternatives, we really put them in those vulnerable positions that make it ripe for people to take advantage of. Does that make sense? Okay. Trauma. Jennifer talked about trauma a little bit. You know, the causes around homelessness are often linked to trauma, like we mentioned, family conflict, you know, verbal, physical, sexual abuse, and not having your basic needs met. I often say that homelessness in and of itself is a traumatic experience. So oftentimes they've experienced a lot of trauma by the time they've gotten to that point, but even if they hadn't, just the fact of losing your home or not knowing where you're going to stay, it puts you in a hyper-vigilant state and often makes you fearful, and that's a traumatic experience. And trauma changes the way our brains work and impacts our reactions to stress. So it might look a little bit different for someone who's experienced trauma than somebody who hasn't. You might think like, well, that's too big of a reaction for what just happened because you don't have the context of the ways in which they've been hurt before. And it can be difficult to understand. You know, irritable mood, heightened stress response. I think that, you know, we want our responses to be healing rather than re-traumatizing. And, you know, I'll say more in the next slide about some of that. But Education is a pathway to stability. I mentioned that a little bit in my personal story. It can be difficult now, right, with the cost of going to college and this kind of thing. But when we interviewed over 200 young people experiencing homelessness across California, we found out that they had career goals. Many of them had career goals, much of which require extensive education to achieve, like becoming a doctor or a social worker or a teacher. And this says that they see education as a pathway out of poverty for them. But there's a lot of barriers standing in the way. So homeless students are more likely to be suspended or expelled than their peers. Again, thinking about that link to trauma and how trauma is manifesting in schools, and then if schools don't have enough resources to be able to respond to that trauma, then if we're just kicking a kid out of school and they also don't have a place to stay, then we've removed that source of stability for them and continuity in their positive relationships. So I think increasing our understanding of like the context of these young people's lives and knowing how prevalent it is can help us to increase kind of our capacity around understanding and empathy. And further, students without a high school diploma are 4.5 times more likely to experience homelessness as adults. And in some recent national research, that was actually the greatest predictor of homelessness, was not having a high school diploma. So being able to stay in school and succeed in school is hugely important, for lifetime earnings, all kinds of things, and being able to achieve your full human potential, right? We need education to help with that. And it's complicated because, the kind of punitive responses they sometimes get in school can also be matched outside. When you think about especially young people that don't have a place to live or might be staying outside, and if you're under the age of 18, there are certain behaviors that are illegal just because you're a minor. So like breaking curfew or running away or truancy. When we think about truancy, it can be hard to get to school when you're experiencing homelessness. I was truant. The SAR board, was sending letters to not my family because they didn't have an address, but to the family that I was couch surfing with. And I could have gotten in big trouble or gotten them in trouble. But there wasn't any kind of response around what was actually happening. It was just like, why aren't you in school? You're in trouble. And then running away, I mentioned like family conflict being such a thing, that a lot of times these young people, this idea about running away is kind of this like archaic notion about just like trying to live off the grid or ride the rails or something super bizarre. That's not really what it is, right? A lot of times if they're running away, it's good to ask, like, what are you running from? And then have opportunities and options for them. And thinking about having alternatives to overutilizing a criminal justice system that's already overburdened, and not expecting that they respond to, social and economic problems. And so I'm sure for the, law enforcement officers here in Stockton, having, safe house to bring a minor to when they find that somebody doesn't have a place to stay is, I'm sure, a position they would much rather be in than taking that young person to juvenile hall. So having those alternatives is just so critical. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot that I've learned, not just in the research, but in meeting with young people experiencing homelessness through the years, is that, they have experiences outside of mainstream society that often give them the ability to look at issues from different perspectives. I know it's always I meet weekly with a group of young people experiencing homelessness, and they often have a more complex understanding of our systems and the gaps within those systems than a lot of my MSW peers who, work in this field. They're, often bursting at the seams with their passion and ideas, and they want to make this world a better place, not just for themselves, but for other young people like them. They're likely to create a street family and find safety in numbers. So again, if you found yourself homeless, it speaks not only to that like economic poverty, but oftentimes kind of like a relationship poverty or loss of your social safety net. But thinking about where young people are, friendships are huge at this age, and also finding safety on the street is, again, kind of a matter of life and death sometimes. So it's not always a bad thing. And like I've mentioned, they feel education is key, and they have goals that reflect that. Another point I wanted to make is that homelessness is a systemic crisis, not a personal failure. I think a lot of times we put the blame on the individual, but when you see a problem this big that's happening across the country, it's not just millions of people that are choosing to be homeless because that's an easy way to live, right? There's millions of people that have fallen through or been swept into the cracks of a system that wasn't necessarily designed or built, for us. So it's tricky, right, in modern times to be able to, be able to get your needs met. And I think, too, about the research. I'm always, reading the latest research, and I think when we need to make sure that when we're listening to people's lived experience, we're also taking history into context. So, when you ask a young person why they became homeless, no one ever says it's because of decades of federal disinvestment in affordable housing, right? But we know that that's true as well, right? Sometimes we just think about the family conflict piece of it, and we don't think about, what are the systemic forces at play that make it difficult. Yeah, and then the family rejection kind of piece of it, that's not the only situation that causes a young person to become homeless, although prevention and reunification are incredibly important when that's the case. And I was so happy to be walking around and hearing from the safety net folks and other people about how that is a lot of the work that you all do, and I thought that was really cool. Okay. Yeah, and I guess the last point I wanted to make on this one is just that, we can't change what's happened historically, but we can take accountability to try and make our systems and institutions better for current and future generations. So what can we do? I've got some policy recommendations. I think of these as our responsibility. Any policymakers in the room? There's a hand. Okay, cool, great. This is for all of us, not just for you, and thinking about how do we communicate with policymakers and how do we let our priorities be known. We don't have to have all of the answers, but one of the ideas is prevent homelessness, right? Support families who are struggling either economically or emotionally or in other ways with supporting their child. And that can look like investing in programs that serve young people experiencing homelessness, especially those that are trauma-informed, have harm reduction philosophies, and have low barrier services. So make it easy for them to be able to get the help that they need. We can also ask young people experiencing homelessness what they need, so that we can build programs that help to meet their needs. Like I said, 2/3 of our counties in California have no programs for homeless young people. We should listen to them and ask them what they need. Because sometimes, as adults, we think we know, but then we might spend all of our time creating solutions that aren't really matched to the problem because we haven't taken the time to listen to what the problems actually are. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then eliminating punitive responses to homelessness would disproportionately impact LGBT youth and youth of color, and can make it even harder, right? If you're being saddled with a criminal record, it's going to be more difficult to maintain your employment or get your education or get into a housing program. And we need to think about, we have to stop punishing people for being poor, and think about solutions that really get to the root of the problem, not just kind of shallow things. Okay, and looking at policies and legislation and our practices with the lens of these young people who are much in need of attention and protection. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the people recommendations, right? We're all people in here, so sometimes policy recommendations take some time, but people recommendations are things that we can all do right now. So the first one that I have, treating people experiencing homelessness with dignity and respect. And that's a simple one. And I'm sure that, everyone in here knows that, but sometimes it can be difficult. Sometimes, especially if you don't have much relationship to people experiencing homelessness, it can be intimidating because there's so much stigma, and we've heard a lot of scary stories. But a lot of times you'll find that if you just acknowledge someone, say hello, how are you, even if you don't have, money to share that day, that they still appreciate just the acknowledgement. Or even saying no, I can't today, but take care. Just treating people like any other community member. That nobody is below us, nobody is less human than any of us, and I know that kind of goes without saying, but sometimes, like Jen was saying, in divisive times, we can feel that way, and we can treat each other that way, but we can do better. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah. And sharing resources when you can or are able to, and whatever that looks like for you. Not everybody needs to give up their living room for 4 months to bring in a young person. That was one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had in my life. But it could also be, bring in somebody a sandwich. All kinds of ways that can look. And then challenge stereotypes about homelessness by choice. So again, we interviewed 200 homeless young people and asked them, if they wanted to change their housing situation, 90% said yes, they did want to change their housing situation. They did not want to be on the streets. And I tend to believe that that other 10% just didn't have hope left. I don't think that it was truly that they wanted to be on the streets. I think that they had kind of given up on a system that wasn't necessarily there for them. And so it's kind of like more about disenfranchisement than like service resistance. Do you know what I mean? And then we can help combat NIMBYism by using empathy and facts. So I know in so many communities it can be difficult thinking about where are you going to place these services or this housing for this community. And sometimes people feel like, oh yeah, we want that to happen, but like not in my backyard. And I think what I would say is that it's in all of our backyards already. These are the communities that we live in. People experiencing homelessness are everywhere, and if we make sure that they're getting the support that they need in terms of housing and supportive services, then we're going to be in safer communities. And everybody's humanity matters. One of the other kind of things I hear a lot when I speak about homelessness is that people think that California has this crisis of homelessness because we have nice weather. And once again, like I mentioned, right, like we rank 50th in the country in terms of housing affordability. We were hit hard by the foreclosure crisis and recession that's pushed a lot of people into the rental market, and there's not a lot of protection around that. So that's been really hard for our state. And I wanted to say that, everyone kind of thinks that people experiencing homelessness are coming from somewhere else, and that's not really the case. What we see in the research is that 70 to 80% of people experiencing homelessness in any given community are from that community. These are our neighbors, and that they tend to move for the same reasons anybody tends to move. It's for connections to jobs, family, and friends, right? Same reasons any of us move. So I think knowing that, can make it so we can, combat these stereotypes when we hear them, and that we no longer perpetrate them ourselves. I think we're all looking for answers, and we have the power to share them and really show leadership. And I guess the last point on that I wanted to make is, I kind of mentioned, but letting your elected leaders know that this is a problem in your community and that you care is awesome. Just kind of, there's not a lot of paid lobbyists that do this work, if you can imagine, and there are for a lot of other issues. And just having your voice heard or being at the table or saying, like, I'm here and I care about this community, then it helps to kind of create that momentum, that education, that political will, so that then your elected leaders can, continue to do more about it. So I believe that California can lead the way in ending youth homelessness. Krista mentioned, but I authored the nation's first state action plan on ending youth homelessness. It's called More Than a Roof, How California Can End Youth Homelessness. So if you're interested, you can Google that and it'll pop right up. There's a lot of different recommendations on there, for education, employment, housing, health, supportive services. So whatever it is that you do, if you're kind of curious, what are some of the recommendations? You can flip to that page that kind of has your specialty and see, what we can do. And that's based, again, from what we've heard from young people and then the best research that exists out there. I blog and I tweet and I try to let people know what's going on in the Capitol and otherwise about youth homelessness. So you can always check out our publications there or email me. One of the pieces of legislation right now, and I don't tell anybody what to do or how to vote or feel, but there is a bill, SB 918, that would create an Office of Homeless Youth Services, and it would use the Prop 64 marijuana funding to be able to provide housing and supportive services for young people experiencing homelessness, which I think is awesome, personally. Yeah, so that bill is being authored by Senator Wiener and Assemblymember Rubio. So if that's something you're interested in, you can feel free to be in touch with them. And let your voice be heard, because honestly, at this point, you all are the experts. If you weren't already, and I'm sure a lot of you are. So there's so much room for us to make progress on this issue of youth homelessness in California and beyond, starting right here in Stockton today. Because we haven't invested enough in holistic solutions, but that can change. We have so much room to do better. So in closing, I'd like to ask all of you to dream big. and think about what you can do to end youth homelessness. And try and share your idea with someone at your table before you leave today. Does that sound good? Great. Okay, thank you all so much for having me. You've been amazing. And I'll turn it back to Krista.